Believe it or not, when I was 11 years old, I was actually placed on a terrorist watch list. The reason was it was 1991 and I was an ambitious 11-year-old. I actually decided that the environment was important to me. And we were experiencing, there was a lot of chatter going on in the news, and there were some movements that were going on where people were saying the environment needs to be paid more attention to, that we're clearing out all the trees, that this is a serious problem. And so my 11-year-old self decided that I wanted to do something to make the world a better place, that I wanted to do something to help the environment. So what I did when I was 11 was a woman came to speak to my 5th grade class. Molly Lizechko was her name. She was a representative for the state of Idaho. And she came and told us about what it takes to create laws. And as I sat there listening as a 5th grade, 11-year-old kid, I thought, maybe I can write a law. I asked her the question. I remember this distinctly in my 5th grade class, raising my hand and saying, Representative Lizechko, so who can make a law? And she said, well, anybody can make a law. And I said, anybody? And she says, yes, anybody. And I said, even me? And she says, that's right, even you. If you're a citizen of this country and, you can present laws and like anybody else. So at the end of the class, she handed us all her business card to all of us 5th grade students at Cynthia Mann Elementary School in Boise, Idaho. She handed out her business cards. And later on, when I went home, I decided to call her office. And I called and I left a message. And I said, I saw you in my 5th grade class at Cynthia Mann, and I want to write a law. And so she called back and she says, well, Kim, what law would you like to make? And this was 1991. And I said, I am really worried about the trees. I'm worried that they're going to be clear cutting all the trees and there will be no trees left for when I'm an adult. I would like trees and I would like my grandchildren to one day still have the trees. So I would like some laws that prevent these timber companies from just clear cutting. So she says, well, this sounds like an interesting law. Of course, this was the state of Idaho. It's a very Republican state. But nonetheless, she showed up to my house, and to my dad's surprise, and my dad opens the door and he says, Molly Lizechko. She says, yes, hi, I'm your rep, and I have a meeting with Kim. And my dad looked at her in surprise and he said, Kim? Well, Kim's a kid. And she says, yes, I know. I met her in her 5th grade class and she called me and she says she wants to write a law. She wants to write a bill. So I'm here meeting with Kim to write a bill. So my dad, taken by surprise, he's a single father raising me by himself, opens the door, invites her in, and he says, come on in and sit down. Luckily for me, I did not know anything about politics at that time. I had no idea my dad was a Democrat in the state of Idaho, which was very Republican. And it also just happens that Representative Molly Lizechko, rest her soul, she's passed away, but she also was a Democrat. And my dad had voted for her. So that was a good thing. So she comes in, we meet, and we craft this anti-deforestation bill. And I went through the entire process when I was 11 years old. I went and I spoke to the committees with, a bunch of white men in Idaho, most of them Republicans, sitting there listening to this 11-year-old kid saying, I'm worried about the trees and we're not doing enough to protect the environment. And I really would love trees to continue to exist. I'm worried that we're going to be ruining our planet. I was like a Sunrise Movement kid, or, I cared a lot. I was there speaking at the Capitol building to a bunch of committee members, people in the state legislature. And we went through the process. It took a long time. The bill didn't actually make it to the legislature for a vote. It did pass the committee. It then went to the House, and it went to a vote in the House. And I went and I sat in the gallery and I watched as the bill that I'd poured my heart and soul into failed. Idaho, the Republican state, did not vote to support my bill, to pass it along to where it would have obviously needed to go to the Idaho State Senate. They chose to kill it right then and there in the House. I was, of course, devastated, but it was to be expected, I suppose. And ultimately, Molly Lizechko said to me that she would take that bill and she would send it to D.C. And there, what I found out later was that the bill was sent to Washington, D.C. It was broken up into 4 separate bills, and at least 2 of those 4 bills did pass. So essentially, this 11-year-old kid from Boise, Idaho, helped make some change, helped pass some of the anti-deforestation laws that were here in the United States. It turns out at around that time in 1991, unbeknownst to me, that around 1990 to 1998, Earth First was a very active environmental organization that was deemed to be terrorism, essentially. They would chain themselves to trees. They would try to blow up efforts to clear cut. They occupied some land in Idaho to prevent some clear cutting from happening. So there was this very aggressive movement of environmental activists who were trying to also do what I was trying to do, which was prevent clear cutting. Well, fast forward after 9/11, and turns out after 9/11 happened that I could not get past airport security. I could not get on an airplane. I didn't know what the issue was. They said that they were going to be doing random checks on people, but they would always point me out of the line. They would say, "Ma'am, come over here with me." I was 21 when 9/11 happened, and they would pull me aside and they would do extensive search of myself, to the point where I would sometimes not make my flights. Whenever I would check in, I would always get the 4 S's on my ticket, which apparently represents, that you're some sort of security, that you need extra security. It actually stands for Secondary Security Screening Selection. And I would get those 4 S's on my ticket every single time I checked in with my luggage, anytime I wanted to fly after 9/11. And I would always get pulled out of the line because I didn't realize what those 4 S's meant. And of course, they didn't tell me at the time that they were writing them on my ticket. And sure enough, I had a very, very difficult time getting through airports after 9/11. That lasted for about 3 or 4 years. And it turned out that after some talking to some FBI agents, which you have the right to find out through the Freedom of Information Act, I found out that I myself had been, in fact, placed on a terrorist watch list. At the age of 11, at that point, I don't know if they called it a terrorist watch list, but they certainly called it a watch list. And after 9/11, they took all of those watch lists because they didn't know what was going on. And they were, they just basically, anybody who was on a watch list got flagged. It didn't matter why you were on a watch list. You were essentially on one big master terrorist watch list. And you would be treated like anybody else, where they claimed it was random trying to get through airports, or if you were applying for visas for foreign countries or anything like that. All of that was going to be extra difficult for those of us who were on these watch lists. And I think through time, because I could tell you that by the time I was about 24 years old, I was clearly not on the watch list anymore. I think through time, maybe they went through the watch list and they determined who was what kind of terrorist in their mind. And they probably figured out at some point, years after, 3 years after 9/11, they must have figured out at some point that I myself was an 11-year-old environmental activist who just wanted to stop trees from being cut down. And I was not actually a security threat. And therefore, I didn't need to be on this watch list anymore. The point of me telling you this is, if I myself, as an 11-year-old who just introduced anti-deforestation legislation in an environmental bill to the Idaho state government, if I myself at 11 years old could land on a terrorist watch list for a domestic terrorist, then you can too. It just depends on what groups you associate with, or maybe what activism you decide to engage in. If an 11-year-old environmental activist could be placed on a terrorist watch list, then anybody can. And that's the fear. Now we have members of the Democratic Party and some in the Republican Party. This is a bipartisan effort. They're now introducing legislation to surveil Americans, to curtail what they call domestic terrorism. But the problem is, it's not very specific. Who's a domestic terrorist? They can go after anybody because the definition of a domestic terrorist is really vague. It's essentially anybody who has anything to say, trying to coerce or pressure the government, who in their minds may or may not at some point act violently. And because they're passing this bill that essentially says they can surveil you, they're not waiting for you to do something violent. They're not waiting for you to commit a crime. All they have to do is suspect you of potentially, maybe one day committing a crime. And that would then allow them to surveil you. So let's go over this. This is a piece of legislation that is being introduced. Now, this one that I'm going to show you is from the Senate. This was actually introduced by Dick Durbin back in 2019 in the 116th Congress. We're now in 117th, but they're saying that they're going to reintroduce this piece of legislation. This one in particular, I want to show you here. This was co-sponsored by 22 different Democrats, 21 Democrats and one independent. That one independent, Bernie Sanders, really disappointing here to see his name on this. Bernie Sanders right there, who had also co-sponsored this bill. But let's go over the text of this bill so that we can understand just what we're dealing with here, that this will in fact target all Americans. Now, I understand that this is written in a way that they're trying to make it seem like this is only going to go after white supremacists and neo-Nazis in America. But let's go through this bill so you can understand that that is not what this bill says. That this bill is not exclusive for just people on the far right, for those fascists, those white supremacists, those neo-Nazis. No, this bill actually can be used to target any activist who has any voice at all. I mean, but what kind of a voice did I have at 11 years old? I wasn't anybody. I wasn't making the news. Back then, there was no real internet to blast me around like the Sunrise Kids or Greta Thunberg. It wasn't like that. I was unknown. I was written up in the local newspapers. That was about it. But anybody out there now who speaks up, who has any sort of a voice that wants to go against the government could be labeled as a domestic terrorist. So here's the bill. This one has been introduced. This one will be introduced in the Senate. There's another one identical to it that's being introduced in the House. And this one right here says, it sounds pretty good. You read it and you say, yeah, I want to stop this. It says, Congress finds the following. 1, white supremacists and other far right-wing extremists are the most significant domestic terrorism threat facing the United States. So they say our big threat is white supremacists, far-right extremists in the United States. Okay. When it comes to domestic terrorism in the United States, I could agree with that our biggest threat is actually these white supremacists or far-right extreme groups. However, I don't think terrorism is a real threat in the United States. I don't think that the Patriot Act and what they were trying to tell us, we've got to protect you from the threat of terrorism. I don't believe that there was this international terrorist threat really truly for the United States that was large enough for us to hand over our rights. And I don't believe that there's a large enough white supremacist threat in the United States for us all to potentially hand over our rights in order for them to stop this. I think it's fringe. I think it's rare. And I don't think all of us need to be surveilled in order for them to combat this. But I do agree that of all of the types of terrorism out there that are domestic terrorism in the United States, white supremacy would be the biggest threat in the United States of this type of terrorism. It says right here, on February 22nd, 2019, a Trump administration United States Department of Justice official wrote in a New York Times op-ed that white supremacy and far-right extremism are among the greatest domestic security threats facing the United States. Now, do I think it's a domestic security threat facing the United States? I mean, do we really think white supremacists are going to come and topple our government? I know that's what they're trying to tell us is going to happen from the Capitol building. The Capitol, look what happened. But was there really, truly any threat that these people were going to take over the Capitol building? And then they were going to thwart our democracy to the point where they were going to take over and instill Donald Trump as president. And there was a true threat of this. I don't think any of us actually believe that there was any real threat of that. Now, do these people commit acts like going into churches or synagogues or into Walmarts or into or schools and they murder people? Yes, that's a threat. But that's not a threat to the security of the country. That's a threat to the security of us individually at times when these extremists happen to get their hands on some guns and they have, most of them have mental issues. Plus they've got these fringe radical ideas and it's a really bad combination. It says right here, regrettably, over the past 25 years, law enforcement at both the federal and state levels have been slow to respond. Killings committed by individuals and groups associated with far-right extremist groups have risen significantly. And then it goes on to give us these fatal terrorist attacks by far-right extremists include. And it goes on and lists all of these different attacks. And it's really bad. I mean, for example, the April 13th, 2014 mass shooting at a Jewish community center and a Jewish assisted living facility in Overland Park, Kansas, in which a neo-Nazi shot and killed 3 civilians, including a 14-year-old teenager. That is frightening. Then it says here, the June 17th, 2015 mass shooting at the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, in which a white supremacist shot and killed 9 members of the church. That is frightening. Goes on here. The March 20th, 2017 murder of an African-American man in New York City, allegedly committed by a white supremacist who reportedly traveled to New York for the purpose of killing black men. That is frightening. Look at this one. The October 24th, 2018 shooting in Jeffersontown, Kentucky, in which a white man allegedly murdered 2 African Americans at a grocery store after first attempting to enter a church with a predominantly African American congregation during service. And the October 27, 2018 mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in which a white nationalist allegedly shot and killed 11 members of the congregation. That is all frightening. And so they list all of these very frightening events to where any person who reads these would say, this is terrible, and we have to do something to try to stop these people. That this is the type of stuff we do not want in our country, that these are the types of behaviors that we need to stop, that we have to figure out how do we stop these people before they commit these crimes. So they go through and they first list event after event after event committed by a white supremacist or a neo-Nazi to get all of us to say, of course, we must do something. To get all of us to say, this is really bad. And we all agree, we condemn these acts, that these are not what we want in American society. But then here's the thing. When they actually then tell us what the law says, this new act, this new domestic terrorism act, what the laws actually say, here's where it gets interesting. They don't actually mention white supremacy or neo-Nazis at all. They don't use those terms. In fact, they say right here, it says in this act, so they go on, they say the term director means the director of Federal Bureau's investigation. The term domestic terrorism has the meaning given the term in Section 2331 of Title 18 United States Code, except that it does not include acts perpetrated by individuals associated with or inspired by a foreign person or organization. So nobody foreign, or an individual or organization designated under executive order. So they're saying basically no one foreign, okay? No one who's in the foreign would be considered a domestic terrorist. So then you say, okay, well, what does Section 2331 of Title 18 United States Code say about a domestic terrorist? If they're saying that this is what we're going to do, is we're going to tell you, we're going to give you the definition of we're going to use the definition of a domestic terrorist. Well, let's just look at that definition real quick. Here it is. Let's find the domestic terrorism definition. It's got to load here. Domestic terrorism right here says means activities that involved acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and must occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. And the term military force does not include any person that has been designated as a foreign person. And anyway, okay, so there it says right there that the term domestic terrorist just means doing something that is dangerous to human life. Okay, so that could be driving your car into a group of people. That could be going in with guns and shooting up a synagogue. But that also could be things that maybe don't exactly kill people, but that are still dangerous to human life, such as blowing up a bridge, blowing up a building, even if it's unoccupied. Okay, that is what they would consider an act of terrorism. So as long as it was done because it was trying to intimidate or coerce the government or civilian population into behaving in a certain way. So now you can see why, when I was 11 years old, they decided that Earth First and potentially even me were domestic terrorists, because Earth First were doing things like they were sabotaging timber companies' attempts at clear cutting. They were blowing things up. They were chaining themselves to trees. They were occupying lands. They were doing things that were considered dangerous to human life, obviously setting off bombs, even chaining yourself to a tree that's dangerous to your own human life, doing these things with the motivation, a political motivation or a societal motivation to try to change behavior. So these Earth First people were saying, well, we're trying to get you to stop clear cutting. We're trying to get you to pay attention to the environment. We're trying to get you to take this seriously. We care and want to protect our wildlife and environment. And so they were doing these things with the intention to intimidate or coerce either the timber companies or the government into action. That definition makes one a domestic terrorist. That would also mean that you could potentially be labeled a domestic terrorist if you say you want to pressure the government into $2,000 stimulus checks. So you go to the Capitol, or just all throughout cities, you stage protests. You say that you have this agenda. You want to pressure the government into $2,000 stimulus checks, and then maybe somebody that's involved in this activity commits some kind of violent act, and then therefore you're labeled a domestic terrorist. I think we could all say that the events from this summer, Black Lives Matter, could fall into this category. Absolutely. Could fall into this category based on the legal definition of what a domestic terrorist is. So they could say, look, you have a political motivation, a political message, right? The political message for Black Lives Matter was we want equality. We want to stop being brutalized by the police. That was really the message. Stop brutalizing us. We want to be arrested like everybody else. We don't want to be shot and killed. That was sort of the message of Black Lives Matter. And that's why they then went on to say, let's defund the police and take some of their funding away. And rather than having them brutalize us, let's put those to community programs. Let's put those towards other things, right? So towards building up the communities, towards building up the populations so that less crime is committed. That was a political message that was being exerted by everybody over the summer during the Black Lives Matter protests. And you could also say that there were many acts of violence that were dangerous to human life during the summer protests. Now, you could argue till you're blue in the face that, well, the people that committed the looting and the crimes and the violence, they weren't the protesters. They were different than the protesters. They just showed up at the protest event. So they just happened to be there, but they weren't part of the actual protesters. The protesters were peaceful. These other people, we don't know, they were just people taking advantage of the protest. Well, that you would have to argue in the courts if you even have your day in court after the government already starts to surveil you because they're using this new domestic terrorism bill and they're allowed to surveil you and you don't even know that they're surveilling you and they're collecting information on you. And maybe in one of your heated moments on social media or to a text message to somebody, you said, you say something a little violent. And then you show up to one of these protests and somebody commits an act of violence. You could be labeled a domestic terrorist. Basically, any movement, any sort of activism could be labeled domestic terrorism using this definition, because activism is in and of itself, by definition, intended to coerce the government. That's what activism is. Otherwise, what are you doing? You're obviously trying to coerce the government into doing whatever it is you want them to do, right? That's a type of coercion. Well, if there's a suspicion that somebody's going to behave violently, if there is somebody who maybe they get too emotional, they get out of hand, they decide to do something crazy like burn down a police station or take over a swath of Seattle, somebody decides to do something like this, you could be then considered tied to a domestic terrorist, even if you weren't the one who did it. And then they would surveil you because you had ties to the domestic terrorist. Why? Well, because you happen to be standing in the same circle as that person an hour before. And maybe you even changed telephone numbers. So this bill goes on. I'm going to show you more of this bill. So this bill goes on to say, so they tell us all of these scary stories that makes us all say, oh my gosh, we absolutely don't want this. And then they say, okay, well, the term domestic terrorist has this meaning. And then they go on to say, So what they want to do is the Offices to Combat Domestic Terrorism, they say domestic terrorism unit, there is authorized a domestic terrorism unit in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis of the Department of Homeland Security, which shall be responsible for monitoring and analyzing domestic terrorism activity. And they've got a domestic terrorism office. There is authorized a domestic terrorism office in the counterterrorism section of the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, which shall be responsible for investigating and prosecuting instances of domestic terrorism, and which shall be headed by the Domestic Terrorism Council. And they say here that there is an authorized domestic terrorism section within the counterterrorism division of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, which shall be responsible for investigating domestic terrorism activity. So they're saying here that they're going to be authorized to combat this domestic terrorism, and that they're going to be, let's see up here, it says the bill is to authorize dedicated domestic terrorism offices within the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Bureau of Investigations to analyze and monitor domestic terrorist activity and require the federal government to take steps to prevent domestic terrorism. So there it is. And then they tell you all of these scary things about white nationalists and neo-Nazis, and you say, oh, well, of course I want this. But when you read the language of the bill specifically omits those terms when they're actually giving authorization to these different organizations and agencies to monitor us, monitoring us not to just investigate acts of terrorism, but to prevent acts of domestic terrorism, getting you before you can commit a crime. They just think you're going to commit a crime, and they're going to get you before you commit a crime. Well, how are they going to do that? Well, they're going to surveil you, and they're going to surveil you without a warrant because they won't need it under this bill. This bill will allow them the authority, if they have reason to believe that you may or may not be a domestic terrorist, it gives them the authority to surveil you. It gives them the authority to snoop into your things. All because you are an 11-year-old who wants to stop the clear cutting of the forests. So this is going to be used against potentially everybody. It really comes down to who's in power. And here in the United States, we change power every 4 years, sometimes to the same administration, but, at least after 8 to a different administration. And so you're handing over this power to God knows who. People might feel safe right now passing this. These Democrats that they're all putting their names on this bill. They're all saying, oh, we want this domestic terrorism bill because we have to stop these white supremacists and we have to stop these neo-Nazis, except the bill doesn't specifically say that when it gives the authority to the FBI to come and snoop on you and to surveil you. It doesn't say that specifically. So when the next administration comes in and they want to stop left-wing activism, don't you think they're going to be using this authorization in order to do just that? That is what they're going to do. Of course. For those of you who are afraid of Trump for the last 4 years, thinking that he was this dictator who was going to ruin your life, well, imagine in 4 years if there's somebody like that again in office and they have this kind of authority and they want to now go after Antifa and anybody they think is Antifa. That's what this is going to be used for. And every 4 years, if the administrations continue to change and it goes from left to right to left to right, it'll just be a different group that is targeted. Every 4 years, it'll either be you or it'll be me or it'll be somebody else or someone else. But it's just depending on who it is that administration decides that they're against or who it is that's against them. Really, what this just means is we are not allowed to coerce the government. That coercing the government or trying to coerce the government, which would just be activism, if it could potentially lead to violence, then they have reasonable suspicion of that, then they have the right to come and surveil us. It's very, very dangerous. This will be used not on just half the country, but this will be used on all of us at some point. It just depends who's sitting in the White House. And I don't know if you feel really comfortable, I know I sure don't, with who future administrations might be. I don't even trust the current administration with this kind of power, let alone future unknown administrations. I cannot see the future. I know many people definitely did not see Donald Trump coming. We have no idea what the future holds. I certainly don't want the government to have this kind of power. They need to have real reasonable suspicion, and they need to obtain a warrant before they can come and surveil us. That has been the system, and that's what needs to remain that system. And we had this issue with the Patriot Act. We know what happened with the Patriot Act. They said, well, it was only supposed to be for this. It was only supposed to be for foreign terrorists. And then they found that, whoops, they were actually spying on American citizens. Whoops. So all of these bills, even when they start off with good intentions and, oh, we're just doing it to protect you, they always morph into something else, and it gets, and they abuse their power, and it gets taken into a different direction, and we never get our rights back once we give them away. We still haven't been able to get rid of the Patriot Act, and we're still dealing with it. And once we hand this away, once we give these powers away, we are not going to be able to get them back. That is what is so scary about this. And what is so scary about it is that so many Democrats are for it. And unfortunately, Republicans are too. And because we're seeing so many Republicans also on board with this, this is surely going to pass. And this will change. This will change everything. This will change. You know, if we thought social media was bad now, it's only going to get worse. Everything's just going to get worse when they can snoop on us and accuse us all of being domestic terrorists. So call your congressional leaders, call them, email your senators, and tell them you do not want this bill to pass, that this is an infringement on the rights of Americans, that we will find another way to combat domestic terrorism, that we do not want another war on terror, that we have not been able to end the first one. It has not gone well, and we definitely don't want to march ourselves into a second one. Call them, email them, do whatever you need to do. Let your voice be heard. But I'm warning you, if you let your voice be heard, you may or may not end up on a terrorist watch list.